Eva had never been one to believe in ghost stories, myths, or local legends. Her rational mind always sought explanations, and she was more inclined to think of the world as something logical, something grounded in physics and reason. But the forest, the whispering pines, it had always made her uneasy. Growing up, her grandmother had often spoken of the woods with a warning in her voice, as if the forest itself were an entity, alive and hungry for something it would not relinquish. Her grandmother's cabin was nestled at the forest's edge, a quiet place she often visited to get away from the bustle of city life. It was a simple place, built of stone and wood, with a tin roof that echoed in the rain. Eva had spent many summers there as a child, her grandmother telling her stories about the forest. Stories that seemed to have a strange weight to them, like they were more than mere tales. But Eva had always dismissed them, laughing off her grandmother's warnings, assuming that they were just fanciful exaggerations. But now, standing at the edge of the forest as the evening sun began to sink, she felt an unsettling shift in the air, a sharp chill even though it was still early autumn. The sky had taken on an eerie hue, crimson and violet mingling on the horizon, and the trees in the distance loomed like dark sentinels, their long shadows stretching far and wide across the underbrush. Eva couldn't explain why, but the urge to enter the woods, to see what lay hidden there, felt almost necessary. A compulsion she couldn't. She grabbed her pack, checked her flashlight, and set off along the narrow trail that meandered through the woods. The path was familiar, winding through a dense thicket of pines and birches, their trunks tall and gnarled, their branches twisting into strange shapes. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. For a while, nothing unusual happened. The sounds of the forest filled her ears, the distant rustle of squirrels in the trees, the call of birds high above, and the steady crunch of her boots on the forest floor. But as the light began to fade, she noticed something unsettling. The woods had grown eerily quiet. The birds had stopped chirping, the rustling had ceased, and even the wind had died down. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Wait. Eva's steps slowed. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. There it was again, the whisper, faint at first, almost inaudible, like the softest rustling of leaves. Eva. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked around, but there was nothing, no one, just the ever-deepening twilight and the oppressive silence of the forest. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease that settled like a heavy weight in her chest. It's nothing, she thought, just the wind, or my imagination. But then, the voice came again, clearer this time. Eva. A cold shiver crept up her spine. It wasn't the voice of the wind or an animal. This voice was human, soft, and almost pleading. Help us, it whispered. Eva's pulse quickened. Who's there? She called out, her voice cracking with a mix of confusion and fear. But there was no answer, only silence. She turned to leave, but something compelled her to keep going. Just a little further, she thought, almost as if the woods themselves were guiding her. The desire to uncover the source of the voice gnawed at her, stronger than any rational thought. The path began to narrow. The trees seemed to crowd closer together, their branches weaving like the fingers of some ancient, unseen hand. The air grew cooler, heavier, as though the very forest was alive, breathing with her. Every crackling twig beneath her boots seemed louder now, as if the forest were amplifying her every move. And then she saw it, clearing. The trees parted as though the forest itself was making way for her, and at the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk wide and knotted with age, its bark dark and scarred, as though something had clawed at it over the centuries. Around the base of the tree lay several stone markers, old and worn, their surfaces overgrown with moss and ivy. The stones seemed to form a circle, a forgotten boundary of some kind. Eva stepped forward, drawn by an inexplicable force. As her fingers brushed against the rough bark of the oak, a sudden tremor rippled through the earth beneath her feet. The ground shuddered, as though the tree were alive, as if it were breathing, pulsing with a rhythm too slow, too ancient to be human. Help us. The voice came again, clearer now, and Eva could almost feel it, like a presence pressing against her chest. She jerked her hand away from the tree, her mind racing. Something was very wrong here. She backed away slowly, but the whispers seemed to follow her, becoming more insistent, more desperate. Help us, please. And then it happened. The oak tree cracked with a sound like thunder, its bark splitting open in jagged lines. From the center of the tree, a dark, slithering mist poured out, crawling along the ground like a living thing. The mist swirled around her legs, clinging to her boots like a cold, suffocating fog. Eva stumbled back, her breath coming in sharp gasps. And then, from the heart of the mist, figures began to emerge, tall, shadowy shapes, their limbs elongated and twisted, their faces featureless but for eyes that gleamed like coals in the dark. They were not human, not fully. Their forms flickered and distorted, as though they were bound to this world by some ancient, broken magic. One of the figures took a step toward her, its movement slow, deliberate. Its voice rasped, low and hollow. "You shouldn't have come." Eva's blood turned to ice as she realized these were not ghosts, not spirits of the past, but something else. Something that had been trapped here for an eternity. Trapped and waiting for release. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot by something stronger than fear. Something primal, a force she couldn't explain. "Leave, now." The figure rasped again, its voice filled with a terrible hunger. Eva felt a cold, oppressive weight settle over her shoulders. It was as if the very air around her had turned to stone, pressing in on her chest, choking. Without warning, the ground trembled again, and the figures surged toward her, their hands reaching out with long, bony fingers. She turned and bolted, the breath catching in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't dare look back, not even once, though she could feel their presence following her, like shadows stalking her every step. She ran through the woods with no sense of direction, no sense of time. The trees blurred by her vision, the ground beneath her feet seeming to twist and shift in impossible ways. It was as though the forest itself was alive, playing tricks on her mind, bending the path, making her lose her way. Finally, gasping for air, Eva stumbled into the clearing at the edge of the woods. She fell to her knees, eyes wide, her hands trembling. She turned around, expecting to see the forest behind her, but there was nothing. The woods were still, quiet, empty. The whispers had stopped. Eva rose to her feet, shakily wiping the cold sweat from her brow. She didn't know how long she had been running or how far she had gone. Her legs ached, her body trembling from the ordeal. She turned toward the cabin, her sanctuary, and began to walk slowly back, but her eyes kept drifting to the edge of and there, standing at the tree line, just beyond the shadows of the pines, she saw them. The figures were watching her, waiting. Her heart skipped a beat, and in that moment, Eva realized the truth of her grandmother's words. The trees, they're not just trees. They were waiting for someone to return, someone who had the power to break the spell, or perhaps someone who could be trapped forever. But Eva couldn't stay. She turned and walked quickly back toward the cabin, the figures fading into the darkness behind her. She never spoke of what happened in the woods. No one would believe her. The whispers had followed her for years. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. The forest never let anyone leave, not entirely, and it would always be waiting.